Fox's position on Alien was essentially hurry up and exceed all expectations. So efforts were underway to get the title character out there. Except it's not one singular character from a filmmaking point of view. Alien 1, 2, and 3 were how they were referred to during creation, what today would be called the facehugger, chest burster, and xenomorph, respectively. Giger came in and began working on the facehugger, ordering in actual bones from all over, even slaughterhouses, to have for casting molds. The preliminary facehugger was nearly finished when Giger was dismissed. The same day, Fox brought in Roger Deakins, a puppeteer who'd worked on Thunderbirds before regularly contributing to other works such as Scars of Dracula and The Land That Time Forgot. He'd just finished up Warlords of Atlantis, and his official brief is notable as among the instructions he was told he needed the creatures to, quote, look in principle similar to the designs produced by H.R. Giger and agreed between Mr. Giger, the director, and yourself. The inclusion of agreement by Giger and Deakins indicates that even from the beginning they didn't want Giger shut out of the production. It's likely they felt that such an important element for the movie's success demanded someone with experience, especially when you have a director who's never produced a commercial feature film before. And Carroll persuaded Ridley Scott himself that it was the right move. They needed professional expertise who knew what they were doing. The irony is that Deakins felt that the people trying to make Alien lacked professional experience and didn't know what they were doing. This contortionist stuff, strapping children onto people, it was, in his words, Mickey Mouse. They floundered about with what to do about the alien he was supposed to make, including at one point asking if Deakins would play the monster. Maybe having a puppeteer inside would be good? As established, the discovery of Balaji Badejo changed that. Meanwhile, Deakins was working on the other two phases of the monster. The chest burster was to be based on Giger's Bacon-inspired concept art, but at 3 times the scale so that it could possess all the needed detail and be physically manipulated by Deakins from inside. They'd just use an oversized recreation of Kane's chest to provide scale to make it look small. But for the facehugger, all they did was just confuse him. It was monster by committee, and finally Dan O'Bannon asked Scott if he could join the work on it. As the head of visuals and with special effects experience, he was the best qualified to guide Deakins through the various elements that were liked in order to create a creature that made sense as a combined whole. 2 weeks after Giger was replaced by Deakins, Scott asked Giger if he could still continue with the film in other ways, though at a lower rate from his previous salary. Part of that was to free up funds for Mobius, the creator on heavy metal that had created a work with O'Bannon for the magazine and whose work had inspired Scott's aborted Tristan film. Someone mistakenly told him that he'd be making $5,000 a week. Well, it was actually $500 a week. Mobius couldn't work for so little for so long, but he agreed to design the suits for 2 weeks. Giger saw them and was complimentary. Like ancient divers, he observed. But after the 2 weeks were up, Mobius was gone, and Deakins, complaining about the shambolic approach to the creatures, meeting with Peter Beale, Fox's money man, to say he wanted off the Alien 3 monster. Carroll worked to smooth things over with Giger, lest they wind up driving all of their visual creatives away, including potentially Scott himself. It was true that he had never created a commercial feature film, but he did have his own production company, with offices in New York, Paris, and London. Being treated like he was a virgin was infuriating for a man with his clear success as a director. Carlo Rambaldi, who had worked on the recent hit Close Encounters of the Third Kind, was to work on creating the monster's head alongside Giger, especially capturing its distinctive secondary jaw. But there was some politics in him coming in, and finally Scott swallowed his pride and accepted the need for Rambaldi. But it was all the more reason he felt he needed to get Giger fully on the picture again. Giger didn't just have the vision needed, but Scott believed he had an obsessive aspect that could help pull things forward without sacrificing quality. If you think of Ridley Scott as a general, he wanted Giger to be on hand to command a vital company on his flank, so he himself could focus on the larger battle. trust that Giger would see their unified vision through so his energy wasn't squandered needing to micromanage the monster. Giger arrived in London and was very depressed at the state of the Alien 3 monster. Like a dinosaur from Disneyland, he said. Then, seeing how his images were being made into the elements of the film, he was even more bothered. As Scott had hoped, the sight of this drove Giger's artistic sensibilities up the wall, and he wanted to take over the Alien 3 monster, unaware that Dickon had already washed his hands of the damn thing. Scott made clear not to further redesign things. They were happy with his existing work. It was just a matter of making it manifest on the screen. Giger threw himself into this, leading a small team in trying to realize his vision. You would probably never guess it from looking at the man or his work, but of all possible actors, the one that Giger venerated most of all was Charlton Heston. But it was from an early role in The Greatest Show on Earth, where he ran the circus. Giger had just been enthralled, and he was delighted that, in a sense, he was being his own Brad Braden, running this tiny circus of his own. He intended to make the most of it. To the consternation of the crew, more bones arrived, including from medical warehouses. Yes, lots of human skulls around. But Giger was upset when he saw the sets being constructed weren't being based upon the corrected designs that he'd made. He was told by the head of construction, Seymour, that it was good for the workers' morale not to find out they've been wasting their time building the wrong set when they can't yet start on the right one. Now it was Peter Beale's turn to be upset. You don't waste money building a set you're going to throw away for the good of morale, and how is morale going to be good when these craftsmen are then told to now rip the whole thing down without shooting one single frame of it? It was a bad decision all around that squandered valuable resources on a picture that couldn't afford to squander anything. To try to recover from lost time and wasted effort, a sort of summit was held, where Scott, Carroll, and Giger visited the home workshop of Dickon. Dressed in black, in a place looking like, quote, a witch's den, you would think that he and Giger would be thick as thieves. Oh no. Giger hated that Dickon wasn't reproducing what he'd already designed, and Dickon resented that someone with his experience was expected to bring no artistic ideas of his own into play. He called Giger's work repulsive abortions. Smoldering, Giger told Scott and Carroll he wanted to create this himself. Seeing Rambaldi's further modifications while working on the head, Giger was secretly thinking he'd not only do Alien 3, but then go on to do the other two as well. This on top of what he was already working on, such as the derelict ship they find. Unfortunately, that was a problem too. Giger had unwittingly created an Escher, perfectly logical on paper, impossible to bring into three-dimensional space. There were discussions, then Giger went back to redesign it. He was getting personally worked up about the possibility of failure, that the film's star would be terrible, and so would the film. He brought in Badejo and solved this like a true artist. They both dropped acid and watched TV. Scott and Carroll both had confidence in the two to create a great antagonist, and told Rambaldi to focus solely on the head mechanics, to let Dickon handle Alien 1 and 2, and Giger to focus on Alien 3. Except when the time came to send the head to Rambaldi to integrate the mechanics, it wasn't ready. Giger was quietly working on Alien 1 and 2 as well, and was having his lover shoot a documentary of his work on the film. In his autobiography, Ian Holm commented on the crabby one-upsmanship between the various special effects teams. The point where Giger finally conceded to Dickon was seeing his final chestburster, which looked just like something that would grow into Giger's nightmare adult, and had all these tricks for manipulation and to burst through the false chest. It had to be scaled down, though, as Scott decided he wanted a life-size version on the set. The Alien 3 head was soon ready to be shipped off to Rambaldi, and it was clear why it had taken so long. For one, it was clear. The monster's flesh was translucent, you could see inside. Giger had taken a human skull, real skull from a formerly living person, made some changes to its structure to incorporate it into the head. He also designed the space jockey that was somewhat of a tug-of-war issue. The executives would rather not bother with it. But Scott insisted they couldn't simply walk into that room and just have a hole in the floor. There had to be something inside. That was good, because what was bad was Dan O'Bannon and Carol coming in to say that they were going to reuse that room for the egg chamber. Giger was appalled. Oh, he hated when you could quite clearly see in a film or TV show the hero running through the same cave over and over as if they were different ones. He grumbled, feeling O'Bannon and Carol were ganging up on him to get this done. How wrong he was. Part of the problem that O'Bannon and Shusett had was that while the two had held out to ensure they would have a role, for the most part they were seen as being superfluous. It seemed like Shusett's main job was to accidentally be in frame or in the way. He was encouraged to go home. "You're just a high-paid fly on the wall." He replied, "But I used to be a low-paid fly on the wall, so this is better." O'Bannon wanted to watch dailies, but was told that he couldn't. To be fair, that wasn't related to his job. Being O'Bannon, of course, he snuck into the projection booth and watched them anyway. What the two and Carol agreed on, though, was that Giger's ship needed to be changed. Scott quietly nodded along with the three of them, and then privately made clear to Giger they were to do no such thing. He was of the opinion that no one would ever accept that the first try could be the only one that was needed. Change would be purely for its own sake. No, go off and actually work on something that needs fixing. With the production falling behind, that was necessary. Beale contacted Dickon to make sure he worked only on the Alien 1 and 2 so they'd be ready, while Giger did his Alien 3 and the spaceship and egg chamber. Giger was starting to become more comfortable with the ephemeral nature of creating things for film, but still insisted on quietly working on the facehugger. But time was rapidly approaching for the full-size monster to appear, and Dickon had a demonstration of his facehugger. Not only looking good, but he rigged up a spot for it to bleed. The blood then hit a fake girder that he'd prepared, which began to dissolve like the most corrosive thing ever had hit it. Oh, it was a hit. Dickon's Alien 1 was a lock. On August 4, his Alien 2 chestburster had its big scene, and as discussed, succeeded spectacularly. Though Dickon would have preferred having it pull itself out of the opening instead of bursting free. Anticipating that Scott would decide in the end he wanted more articulation, Dickon had created a secondary stunt tail for the chestburster so that when air burst in it, it would whip around and knock things over. Scott was delighted and did 3 takes of the little monster knocking things around. Giger noted in his diary that it certainly looked like a success to him and that Dickon was happy as a lark. But Giger had his own problems. First, O'Bannon left, never to return. Scott said it was a puzzler, that he wasn't sure if the film's creator had been happy that someone passionate was making his movie or hated him because O'Bannon wished he was the one directing it. After a solid year of work, O'Bannon was just cooked. He just wanted to be out of there, especially since none of it really required his work anymore. But with him gone, Giger was down an ally, and there was a collective meeting where the lack of a working Alien 3 was the sticking point. Giger was on the verge of quitting. It was watching the rushes of the chestburster scene that changed his mind. It changed everyone's mind. The scene that had convinced Brandywine to pursue this film was everything they all could have hoped for and more. Giger felt renewed, but now accepted the reality of the situation. His dream of a monster with transparent flesh was not going to happen. The head could work, but not the rest of it. There was just no more time. They had to finish, or else he knew they'd be taken off and someone else would finish it. They told me we should have the best experts in the world to work with us in such a big production, and instead of that, we've got a lot of do-it-yourself amateurs without the necessary experience. To make matters worse, his own space jockey design was drawing away all the plaster experts he needed to help. That and Ray Bradbury. 6 of them left to go work on the 3-part TV movie The Martian Chronicles in Malta. Further bad news arrived in the form of Rambaldi and his mechanical head. There were stories about his work on the King Kong remake that the 40-foot-tall mechanical ape malfunctioned, and when the head was removed, no one seemed inclined to question that rumor. You could even see the springs that made the inner jaw shoot out. It was just so not ready for shooting. And the tail was simply too heavy to be functional. And then there was the creative idea of Scott's to allow the audience to see the creature's brain in action via writhing maggots. As he wryly observed the result, even Giger went, yuck. Badejo, who has been taking mime classes and learning Tai Chi, has been menaced by Yaphet Kotto and tripping with Giger, had finally had his limit. He was not going to let them put maggots on his head. Work on the Alien 3 costume was complete, and while Scott was happy, he was going to take a page from Jaws and avoid the temptation to show too much of it, especially with how well it could blend into mechanics of the ship. It could menace just because you don't even know if it's there. It consisted of around 10 to 15 separate pieces, depending on what it needed to do in a scene. To Giger's disbelief, after having been meticulous about building it for Badejo, on the very first day when the appearance wasn't working out, the alien coming down to get Brett, a stuntman was brought in, stuffed into the suit that was too long and too skinny for him. It was overall a learning experience for everyone, especially how the final mechanized head and tail worked. When he and Badejo watched the rushes, Giger was delighted to see just how well this monster had come to life. His star was everything he'd hoped it'd be. Also concerned about his creation was O'Bannon. When Alan Dean Foster's novelization of the film came in, it needed to credit the author. He had no idea. He wrote down, and to a whole bunch of people. He essentially left it for them to figure out who got the credit, and originally Fox said, credit Hill and Giler for the screenplay, and O'Bannon and Shusett for the story. Well, the fight was on for who should get credit for the script. Overall, it seems fair to say that Hill and Giler did create the script. It didn't go from being called crap to the best script I've ever read because they changed some character names and tweaked some dialogue. But you'll recall O'Bannon having his credit diminished on Dark Star, and he was damned if he was going to get shortchanged again, even if it seemed like story by was an accurate description of his role. As for Yaphet Kotto, the day had arrived for Parker to die, and he was struggling to accept it. He was convinced that he could do what Will Smith would later do in Independence Day, just one solid punch and the monster would go down. Badejo finally demonstrated the delusion this was. His tall, thin build hid the fact that he was actually incredibly strong, and Kotto is not a small man. So when Badejo finally grabbed Kotto and lifted him off the floor, that was enough to show that Parker was no match for the alien. Still, Scott left him with a chance for a heroic, if futile, end, and to make his death impactful using the second set of Jaws. As for Cartwright, the death of Lambert barely required acting from her. She described Giger's creation as exquisite, high praise for her to be mesmerized by the beauty of her destroyer. Weaver likewise praised the beauty of this menace, and the sight of it made Tom Skerritt wonder why Dallas was so stupid as to get into a confined space with that thing. He accepted that it was guilt. Dallas had ignored quarantine and Ripley, and now Brett was dead, and the rest were in danger. He couldn't live with the idea of someone else dying. Famously, in a scene that didn't make it into the final cut, we discovered that Dallas wasn't dead yet, but slowly being digested to create an egg. Rather than being laid, the creature used its victims' bodies to create eggs. Of course, the egg's big scene was actually on the alien ship, the place where the big, impressive shots would take place, rather than the cramped Nostromo of the rest of the film. But things were straining to the breaking point. Word came from Alan Ladd that shooting ends on Friday. Scott said it wouldn't be done, and he wasn't going to accept doing substandard work. Peter Beale was stuck in the middle, trying to figure out how to play Solomon here. The film was going over budget, not helped by Seymour, the one who built that obsolete set, remember? Quietly building sets for scenes they'd already cut for expense. But Beale had seen the film they were getting. He knew this wasn't a money pit. He was watching Star Wars get made all over again. So he told Scott essentially, okay, we won't shut down. But starting Monday, I'm going to be here with a schedule and a stopwatch. This is the only way this picture will ever be finished. Well, things had gone wrong in constructing the set for the shuttle. not creating the space correctly for the alien to hide in, particularly because Scott's impromptu drawings had been wrong. Giger, proud of his creation, happily pretended that it was his notorious perfectionist streak that was the reason Seymour and his wretched team had to rebuild it, rather than letting the blame fall on Scott. With typical Giger attitude to the production, he felt, "They can lick my butt." But while that was being worked on, the question was what exactly was going to happen. The reason Coda was pushing for him to kill the monster was that the ending was in flux. So Scott and Carol ruminated on it, and then they pitched the idea to Fox. Ripley would see the monster, ready to blast it out the airlock. But then just as she's about to, its tail takes her head off. The alien sits in the seat and, mimicking Dallas's voice exactly, says, "Hopefully the network will pick me up," and sets a course for Earth. Ladd's response was to send 2 executives out to England to demand Scott explain when exactly it was he'd gone completely insane. One thing they all knew from the footage they'd seen, Sigourney Weaver was going to be a movie star. She survives, or Scott was fired. Scott agreed, and Walter Hill was relieved, calling it, quote, "one of the worst ideas we have ever heard." While O'Bannon didn't weigh in on that, from all accounts of his personality, I would say it's likely it would have delighted him. And he was pleased with Scott's approach to special effects, which was to not try to approach it the way Lucas and ILM had, but rather like 2001. Alien wasn't an adventure. It was about suspense, and while the effects needed verisimilitude, you weren't supposed to wow the audience. This wasn't the blockade runner escaping the Star Destroyer. This was that tramp steamer coming into port and smacking the pier by accident. Additionally, O'Bannon was desperately fighting one final battle on the film, his credit. He asked for several of them, given the roles that he had performed, but it was made clear that visual effects supervisor was the only one he was going to get. He wasn't in any of the guilds for those other roles. He wasn't the only one. Dickon felt shortchanged for his work, that his active role in performing the creatures was ignored, and that Giger was getting special credit while he was not. Other disgruntled voices were heard, though much of it was because it was obvious Alien was going to be huge. Star Wars meets Jaws, that's what they were thinking. Realizing that he, the originator of the film, was getting one tiny credit, O'Bannon called up Hill and asked that he be listed with them as screenwriter. But Hill was concerned about his own reputation. The Driver had been a massive flop. He was now working on The Warriors. It was likely a desperation to have his role on Alien be prominent to ensure his career didn't tank if that film failed as well. However, while the Hill-Giler script is what won everyone over, during the filming the actors improvised a lot of the dialogue. And because he was present, O'Bannon had whipped up replacement lines for Ridley Scott as the film morphed during production. He argued that while perhaps he didn't write the screenplay wasn't what the film actually was. The Writers Guild of America handled the arbitration and made the final decision. O'Bannon would get sole screenwriting credit, and he and Shusett would get story credit. Hill and Giler would get nothing. A substantial reason for that was because Hill and Giler were both separately credited as producers. If they'd just been brought in to revise the screenplay, it would have been different. But since they were essentially making the movie, it was considered to have just been part of their work as producers. O'Bannon was delighted for about 5 minutes. Then someone started asking questions about it, the terror from beyond space. Is it true that Alien blatantly rips off that film? In an interview, Giler said that he imagined it's a trope, like a gunfight in a Western is. But when further questioned on it, added, well, you'd have to take it up with Dan O'Bannon. He is the credited writer on the film, after all. The question of it didn't go away, and soon Fox was hit by a potential lawsuit from A.E. Van Vogt, who wrote The Voyage of the Space Beagle, which it had been based upon. He wanted money and a credit that was based on his original work. They convinced him to take $50,000, but no acknowledgement. Jerome Bixby of It also sued, though admitted his film was also derivative of The Thing from Another World. Even someone named Jack Hammer sued, saying Alien was stolen from his script, Black Space. All the drama was no surprise. Hollywood has a saying, success has many fathers, but failure is an orphan. Still, with the success, there seemed room for everyone to be gracious. Ridley Scott said in interviews that this was an art film, but not the way everyone thought of that, but because of the genuine works of art created by Giger and Dickon and all of the others that created everything around the humans that lived it and in it. O'Bannon agreed, saying that Scott's directorial and visual hand laid over the work of many others. And Scott agreed to an extent, saying that one must never underestimate the quality of that script. Hill agreed it was a good script, but noted, whatever the quality of the script, films have to be realized. And so much credit needed to go to Scott and the actors, especially Weaver. It seemed that while everyone was insistent on getting their proper credit in the film itself, when it came to discussing the film, everyone was far more generous. As the recent Jaws and Star Wars could attest, the Oscars have a history of snubbing successful genre pictures, though Alien did get a nomination for Best Visual Effects. H.R. Giger had to practically be restrained by his girlfriend not to go leaping to get onto the stage, but he joined his fellow creatives accepting the award. And backstage, to his immense delight, Giger got a congratulatory handshake and a compliment on his work from Charlton Heston. The entire process had been a nightmare, but the visions from O'Bannon to Scott to Giger and others all brought a truly unique creature into the public collective consciousness. Despite all the setbacks, it was perfect. The question on all their minds was, how do you follow perfection?